Welcome to the Rise to the Challenge podcast. Joined today, he's the founder of Honkaku Spirits, author, entrepreneur, and podcast host. It's Christopher Pellegrini. How are you doing today, Christopher?
Thank you very much for having me, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're so excited to have you on the show to talk about your rise to the challenge. What we like to do with all of our guests is go right to the beginning. Talk about where you're from and what were you involved in growing up?
I'm from Bristol, Vermont, in the northeastern United States, born and raised, and I was involved in all sorts of just a normal kid growing up in the hills, sports, everything, and I ended up getting into alcohol at a pretty young age. I think we'll just cut straight to the chase. I was a very young home brewer. I started homebrewing when I was in my early teens, and yes, this was a secret. Yes, it was illicit. Yes, I'm sure I shouldn't have been doing it, but I believe the statute of limitations has lapsed on that, so I should be all right. And I took a really keen interest in craft artisanal beer, for starters. And one thing led to another, and I really got more and more into it. It was kind of a rabbit hole. My parents found out about my home brewing operation, were not very impressed, shut me down in a heartbeat. But I took my experience and my passion to the local microbrewery called Otter Creek, which is in Middlebury, Vermont. And I finagled my way into an apprenticeship of sorts, or a paid apprenticeship. And I was basically just learning all aspects of the brewery. I really wanted to be brewing, but I was still I was pretty young. How old was I? I was probably like 17 years old, maybe almost 8. Yeah, 17 years old at the time, I think. And and then one fateful week at the brewery, our lead brewer wrecked his back and couldn't haul 50-pound bags of grains around the brewery anymore. And then the same week, and this was just the worst thing that could ever happen to the brewery, but our second brewer left the state to join the circus.
Oh,
as sometimes happens. And so we were without anybody who could make the beer. And when the CEO came in and asked, we had an all hands on deck meeting and asked, hey, does anybody here know how to make beer? And little, 17-year-old me is like, oh, and I remember the reaction was not positive. The CEO was like, the kid? And our cellar master was like, if he doesn't drink it, he's legally allowed to make it. And that's how I became the youngest commercial brewer in the United States, back when I was still in high school. And I was immensely proud of my work. I was the most annoying underage beer snob you've ever met in your life. And I continued to really develop that passion for the types of drinks that people will line up with growlers, on the weekend to fill up before they go hiking or whatever. And that I was really, really happy with what I was doing. And even though I had the night shift, which I didn't love all that much, because a dark, like a lights off brewery with only one person in it, I believe that's a setting for a horror film. If it hasn't been made yet, it should, because there's some weird sounds happening in that space at night, creaking and little percussive explosions and steam letting off all the time. It's not a fun place to be at night. I'll just take my word for it. But that was, I guess those are the roots, I suppose, which would go on to inform much of the rest of my life, to this day even. And yeah, I miss Vermont.
For someone that gets into home brewing and craft beer and those kind of things at a young age, it's definitely a unique palate that you're having for that kind of product. How does someone get involved or interest at the age you were? Were you exposed to it and experienced it at home? Were your parents drinking it and you just were amazed by the process, things like that?
How did that happen? That's a great question, Alex. Well, I guess, at the risk of making my parents sound highly irresponsible, they were not. They were two of the most upstanding people you've ever met in your life. But my parents, both educators, had a lot of dinner parties for family, for my mother's church group, for their colleagues at the high school, junior high school, stroke senior high school. And so we always had people over, and my mother she tended to be in the kitchen. My father tended to be flying all over the place. And my job from when I was in elementary school, and this started probably even before elementary school, was to go around, take drink orders, and make the drinks. And we had what my parents called a dry sink. It was this beautiful antique place where all the booze was kept. It was like a home bar. And I would crack cans of beers and rip open wine coolers and pour simple cocktails, 2-ingredient cocktails for people. And I would just keep people topped up for the night. And I was kind of the morale officer of sorts, just making sure everybody had what they needed. And I didn't think it was really anything special, but I started to learn a lot about alcohol through that. I started to learn the way people like their drinks. And I learned what made a drink too bitter and what made a drink too sweet. And my, my mother's mother, Granny, always loved bourbon and water. And my grandfather used to get so jealous because my grandmother would only drink the bourbon that I made for her. She wouldn't drink it if he made it, because he said, "Oh no, when you make it, it's too weak." Bourbon and water. So it was fun, you know. And then so that was kind of just getting used to using alcohol almost on a weekly basis, or at least a bi-monthly basis. And then getting into high school, just before I started down this path of home brewing. And my parents weren't really beer drinkers. I guess that's something I should say. My mother loved a little bit of bourbon. My father didn't really drink at all, to be honest with you. And my mother was not a drinker. She was a social drinker, but that was it. And she'd have a drink or two over 6 hours. And so it was hosting. And then it was in high school in a history class. I was working in a group project, and part of the project is everybody was given a decade in American history, and we had to create a newspaper that was emblematic of the times. It had advertising that was from that decade, and it had major stories that we had to write ourselves. We had to do the research and learn about what was happening at the time. And we had the 1920s. And of course, in American history in the 20s, one really big thing that was happening domestically was prohibition. Yeah, I mean, right at January 1920, boom. There's an amendment, and all alcohol is illegal, right? So there was a lot written about that. There was a lot written about the process of prohibiting alcohol, and then there was all of the bootlegging stories and the mob and everything. We were at the library. We were going through microfiche. You've got all these newspapers that are put onto film from, at that time, it was like, geez, that was back in the 90s. So we're talking 75 years prior. And we're just reading through, geez, it was a mad time back then. And everybody was making hooch at home. So we're like, you can make alcohol at home. We should. And so then all of a sudden hit pause on the prohibition research, go straight into home brewing research. We're like, how do you do that? And so we started researching that. And then that naturally led to what was big in the 90s, which was home brewing. That was the home brewing boom, had started before that and was in very healthy shape in the 90s. And we just kind of looked at each other and said, this is me and my really close friend, Jesse. And we're like, we should probably do this. And we started, and we cobbled together a brewing kit. And every Sunday when my parents went to church, we had control of the kitchen, and we made a batch, and that's how I got into it. And it became more and more enjoyable as we figured out how to keep everything immaculately clean and increase our odds of getting a decent batch out of it. And we, fine-tuned our recipes, and we were working all malt extract at the beginning, basically the really beginner's way. And then we started mixing in other grains, and we started dry hopping, and we started kegging, and yeah. And that, I mean, it was so much fun to figure out how to do it right. And it took a long time. We did it for this was a couple year project that we were doing. And we kind of, we made a little bit of a name for ourselves locally in terms of the guys who could make good beer. And then one day my parents found out, and the whole thing went to kaput. But hey, that's how I got into it.
But it definitely shows that you did somehow, school brought this passion of yours to light, and you were able to experience a lot more, and you kind of fell in love with it. And now if you look at your career past that, it has been your career, and it's not just a job, it's a fun project, a passion of yours that you continue to do today.
That's right. Yeah, it informed a lot of my decisions, even though I didn't get directly into alcohol after I left the brewery. I got into education just like my parents, and education took me back to my former, where I graduated high school, and I taught there for a while. And then I switched venues entirely. I moved to Korea, and before Korea was Spain, then Korea. I was working in Korea, then ended up in Japan, where I am to this day, 20 years later. And that's where I fell face first down another rabbit hole, which is related to Japanese spirits. And that became a quick hobby, which became a passion, which became a career. And now I've switched almost completely from education into the beverage alcohol industry, and primarily trade. Education is still a big part of it, though, because that's basically my role, is to brainwash people.
Did your parents were not all for the idea of moving abroad in a way, or they were like, you need to go do what you love to do or what you want to do, and they were all supportive in that decision?
Both. Primarily from the start, my parents were very like, you need to do what gets you out of bed in the morning, and whatever, we're going to be supportive of that as long as you're not breaking any laws anymore. And so they were supportive, and they were fine with me moving overseas. My parents actually met while they were both teaching overseas at a private school in England. And so there was that travel gene somewhere in my DNA. And I think there did come a point, however, where my parents were like, okay, that's enough, you can come home now. Which I'm sure there's still a little bit, there's a residual amount of that left in the system, but they've also come to terms with the fact that I do have a home and a life over here in Tokyo, Japan, and I've been here for 20 years now. It was 2 years in Korea before that, and a year in Spain before that. So yeah, I mean, I've spent way more time outside of the States than I ever did in my hometown. So it's a weird one, but yeah, my parents, overall, and even to this day, are extremely supportive of everything. And without them, I obviously wouldn't be where I am today.
We'll talk about Japan later in the interview, but you mentioned Korea and Spain. Is there memorable moments you had while living in those areas?
I lived in Sevilla, in southern Spain for a year of studying Spanish, ostensibly, allegedly. And it was a good lesson in life. I spent a lot of time trying to make money because I was an idiot, and I showed up in the country for a year with not nearly enough in savings.
Mm-hmm.
And, on a student visa, you're not supposed to be working. So it wasn't easy to figure it out. But I guess that's a story for another day. But I guess the Spanish experience was a time when I really learned who I was and who I was not. Because it's not very easy to fake when you're speaking another language, and you're trying to make ends meet, and there's just too much going on. You just kind of have to be yourself and get your head down. So I grew up a lot during that year, I think is safe to say. I went from a very safe undergrad experience to a kind of, well, shoot, if I don't cobble together enough money, I'm going to get kicked out of this apartment type of existence. So, or much less have anything to eat. So it was a good kind of wake up time for me. South Korea was far more stable because I was gainfully employed in the education system, and I was learning very quickly. America had sort of soured me on education a little bit, because half of my time in the classroom in a junior high school, senior high school environment was just pure discipline and it was like herding cats in a bag, and it was not very enjoyable and not well paid, and I didn't feel like I was reaching anybody really. And then transitioning to a social environment where teachers are just automatically more respected, and you have more time and more bandwidth to kind of reach people in the way that you want them to learn, or you want them to develop. So that was great, just because I didn't abandon what I could tell was also a very important thing to education was very important to me. I could tell that I had some amount of competence in education, and teaching in America almost drove that out of me. So I'm glad that I kind of just hit the reset button and left the country, because I don't know if I would have done it otherwise. So Korea was good for that. And it was also really important because I met my wife there, and it was her idea to move to Japan. I wasn't on my radar at all, but she did not like her job. She was in finance, and she said, "Hey, why don't we just move to Japan for a year? I've always wanted to live there, and we'll see if our relationship continues to go well." And I was like, "Hey, sounds good to me." And 20 years later, we're married and we're still here, so.
You talked about taking that risk, and even when you were changing towns that you were living in, you're taking a risk because you're going from Spanish speaking to Korean speaking and now Japanese speaking. Is making those risks something that's in your blood, where it's not going to stop you from accomplishing what you want to do.
I never thought about it that way. I didn't really think of it as a huge risk. I thought of it as being time consuming, energy consuming. I saw it as not knowing what the outcome would be. So I guess that was a risk. I tended to plan just for trying to be successful over a year or two, and then reassess from there. So I was very ready to hit the reset button again if necessary, but I was also determined to see something through to the end. So I didn't bail on anything, which I'm kind of proud of, even though, yes, times were occasionally tough. But it was certainly a challenge. No doubt about it. I mean, I purposefully chose a part of Korea where I could tell there just weren't that many out-of-towners, and I was going to throw myself into the deep end, which I find to be hilarious. I think it's a great exercise in learning who you are. Yeah. And then by the time I moved to Japan, so it was my third experience learning a new language, being in a totally new environment, I was kind of getting used to it a little bit, because I just had learned to accept the things that I can't change and accept the things that I don't understand, and to just observe, adjust, and get on with it. And I think that was very, very helpful. I had learned how to deal with culture shock. And of course, yeah, everybody deals with culture shock every time they move to a neighboring town, or they join a new company, or they join a new soccer team. There's a culture there that you have to adjust to. And I got a lot better at shortchanging the progression, which is very much like this. It's not linear. Of just like the day-to-day stuff that makes you depressed or frustrates you, and it makes you act in ways that just are not part of your normal character. And I learned to recognize those moments and say, okay, why am I feeling this way? Something's obviously pissing me off, probably not for a good reason. I need to just take a step back. I need to go with the flow, and tomorrow's going to be another day. And I think that's, well, now I've been here for 20 years. And I think maybe if I had started in Japan as my first outside of Vermont outside of America experience, I might not have lasted 20 years. I might have lasted one. And then I would have been like, all right, this is too much for me. I'm gonna restart somewhere else, probably back in the States. So I think the progression was good, and learned a lot about myself along the way. I know I've said that a few times, but it is important to figure out who you are and who you are not, and that can be done through challenging experiences. That's for damn sure.
Well, even that same concept, people even utilize in the job world, where they think, "Oh, I'm going to be here forever," and they just get used to the same thing. And then there's some instant that makes them realize, I can do better. I can do something different. I can adapt. And I always feel that having that culture shock, and even for me changing jobs, I needed that, because I needed to showcase what I can offer. Because if a job's not going to let me show them what I can, and they're kind of restricting me, that's not the right spot. So you mentioned that maybe the going to those Spain and Korea were the best decisions, because you gained so much knowledge. You learned a lot about yourself. So where you are in Japan, you become a better version of yourself, and you'll be able to handle anything that you face.
I believe so. I think it's a sum of all of those experiences, and without them being there, then I just wouldn't have the tools to kind of deal with the things that are in front of me right now.
For people that are listening, they may not see Christopher's background with a bunch of bottles in his background. Talk about the creation of your spirits company. How did the name come about? And what was the big moment that wanted you to start that?
So I get to Japan. This is back in 2002, and I knew about sake, Sake. Just a quick primer on pronouncing Japanese words, and I think everybody will enjoy this. The nice thing about Japanese is, I will say, is a very difficult language to learn for a native English speaker.
Mm-hmm.
Things that are easy about it, I guess, is the pronunciation. Believe it or not. Why? Because there are only 5 vowel sounds. They have an A, E, I, O, U. Easy, right? We have those. Now, the nice thing about the vowels here, which make it easier than speaking English, is that there's only one way to pronounce each of those vowel sounds, unlike English, where there's a bunch of different pronunciations depending on the other letters that surround the vowel. In Japanese, when you see a Japanese word, just imagine that you're reading the word in Spanish or Italian. So A is always pronounced A. E is always pronounced E. I is I. O is O. And U is U. If you can just remember those 5 vowel sounds, and when you see them in a Japanese word, you're 99% of the way there. Also, don't stress any individual syllable. Japanese is a very kind of even language. There's no real stress in the sentence, really, unless you're angry about something, and then you stress lots of weird stuff. So the common word that everybody knows, Sake, which is often called the national drink of Japan. It's one of them. A lot of people pronounce it sake, but just given what I said about the pronunciation, we already know that that's wrong, right? Sake, pronounce it like Spanish, sake, right? So I'm going to talk about sake. When I first got to Japan, I started studying means sipping, drinking sake. My experience with sake was very poor in the States in the 90s. It was, it's a brewed beverage, and people in the States often didn't know how to deal with it. They would open the bottle and leave it on a shelf. It's a brewed beverage, like beer and wine. You leave it on the shelf, it's going to go off. So I drank a lot of terrible sake in the States. And I came here and was very pleasantly surprised that it's actually an amazing drink. And even though it's all made from rice, there's a ton of diversity in the sector, and I was loving it. I was really pleased to enjoy it a few times a week. And then one fateful day, a bartender who must have been bored pushed one of the country's indigenous spirits in front of me. Now, a couple of other words and these are the ones that have really taken over my life. Shochu, S-H-O-C-H-U, shochu. Just pronounce it like the verbs show and chew. Show me how you chew your food, like you would say to a little kid. Hopefully not somebody older. Shochu, and then Shochu's slightly older cousin, Awamori, A-W-A-M-O-R-I, Awamori. These are Japan's indigenous spirits, and shocker of all shockers, they outsell sake in Japan. Spirits that outsell a brewed beverage is crazy, right? Can you imagine like vodka outselling beer in the States? I mean, people drink a lot of vodka, but no, that doesn't make any sense at all, right? Beers are lower alcohol percentage. You're just naturally going to drink more of it by volume. So anyways, these spirits outsell sake in Japan and have every year since right around when I arrived. So I arrived in 2002. From 2003, 2004, that's when shochu and awamori sales pipped sake sales domestically. So it was the boom times. And I was fascinated because these spirits can be made from 53 approved ingredients.
Wow.
So it's the most diverse spirits class in the world. And one interesting thing about this spirits class is that they're all single pot distilled. Now, anybody who knows about spirits will know a little bit about how a still works. If you paid attention in chemistry class, you might also remember that a still is used to purify liquids. And so if you put beer in a still, you have something that can be made into whiskey. If you put wine in a still, you've got brandy. All right. If you put fermentations with these approved ingredients in a still in Japan, you have probably shochu, as long as it's single pot distilled and no additives. Now, single pot distillation is really rare. It's rare for two reasons. Number one, the alcohol percentage doesn't go up very high, which is not great because you can't sell it for very much money. And number two, it's really hard to make. You have to have a beautiful fermentation, because if there are any off notes in the fermentation, they will show up in the distillate, in the spirit. That's why usually double fermentation, triple, 3 times through a still is more common, because you get an increasingly higher alcohol percentage and you get fewer weird notes in the spirit. So shochu, the indigenous spirits of Japan, the goal is the opposite. Lower alcohol percentages, but more character, more aroma, and more flavor from the ingredients that were used to make the spirit. And that for me was just so craft beer, I couldn't get over it. I was so smitten. I was in deep smit. I was so fascinated by these spirits that were everywhere in Japan. I had never heard of them before. And this was just a gigantic industry hiding in plain sight that the rest of the world had never heard of. 2002, 2003. So there's Wikipedia might have existed, but there was no shochu page, that's for sure. And so nobody could tell me anything about these drinks. I was just like, what the hell is going on? How can this be? Every supermarket, every convenience store, every restaurant and bar has shochu on the menu. I'd never heard of it, right? And so I wanted to know where I could learn more about it. Nobody could tell me anything. I'm like, where do they make it? They're like, well, it's down south, down in Kyushu and Okinawa. I was like, I didn't even know the geography of Japan at the time. Can I take a train there? And they're like, yeah, you could. Take forever. You want to fly, probably. So I did. And I guess this is probably something that may be coming out about me here on this podcast, is that if I'm curious about something I just kind of go and figure it out. And that's kind of what happened with craft beer when I was in high school. It happened with languages. It happened with pretty much everything, and it happened again with these drinks. I was really interested in them. Nobody could tell me anything about them, so I said, "Fine, I'll go find out myself." And I flew straight down there. I spoke no Japanese at the time too. It was kind of embarrassing, and I just knocked on distillery doors and said, "Hey, can I see?" And they would say, "No, go away." And it was kind of that way for a while, and eventually I caught some people at the right time. And also, when you're in these small mountain towns where the distilleries are, word gets around pretty quick that there's a weirdo at the local pub who's really interested in learning more about the drink. Word travels fast, and so often my reputation would precede me to some of my guerrilla distillery visits, and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, you're the weirdo from the pub, aren't you? Oh yeah, we heard you're harmless. So okay, you can come in. Just don't touch anything." And so eventually people started to allow me in, and they would start to explain. And I would say, "Listen, I did this. I worked on a brewery floor. I get it. I respect it. It's hard, backbreaking work. I love it. Just tell me how it works." And I was floored by the differences in fermentation. That was just, I mean, they didn't have a mash tun. There was no lauter tun. It's like, how do you work with these ingredients if you don't have there's no boil, there's no hot side to this process? How does that work? And that's probably a discussion for another episode, but it's just a totally different fermentation culture. And it's part and parcel with Japanese cuisine. I mean, it's all Japanese fermentation is related for these drinks, for sake, for shochu, for everything, for miso, for soy sauce, meating. It's a fascinating culinary culture. And I was just kind of starting to scratch the surface of it. And that was the beginning for me, going down there, meeting people, making friends, getting some hands-on experience with the drinks, and learning how intertwined with the local culture these drinks are. I mean, it's Kyushu Island, which is southwestern Japan. There's 7 prefectures, 7 states on this island. And the southernmost state, called Kagoshima, is a little bit smaller geographically than Connecticut. It's just a little, it's very comparable in size. So you have a space the size of Connecticut, 110, 112 active distilleries.
Wow.
I know, it's nuts. So I was just, it was the most amazing thing to me that it's literally hiding there in plain sight. And yet it's totally taken for granted. It's just a normal part of everyday life in Japan. And incidentally, the word sake in Japanese means alcohol. So shochu is sake as well. And if you go down to Kagoshima Prefecture and you say, "Hey, give me some sake," they'll give you shochu. Now, this eventually all of these experiences compounded over decades, led to me writing a book about the shochu handbook, because I wanted to reach a wider audience. I wanted to teach people about it. And then that eventually led to me being anointed, or I don't know what you would call it. I became an official ambassador per the Japanese government for these drinks, and they flew me around the world to brainwash people and do classes and tastings and that sort of thing. And I was really enjoying it, as you can probably imagine. But the progress was so slow in terms of the uptake of these drinks internationally. I saw so many opportunities for shochu to become an established category, the type of spirit that should just be on every back bar. I mean, it's such a huge industry too. If you think about the pure volume, I mean, in 2019, before the pandemic started, there was more shochu and awamori made in Japan than tequila in Mexico.
Wow.
And yet 2/3 of tequila is exported. Most of that export going to the States. The States is Mexico's biggest trade partner on tequila and mezcal. So 66% of tequila leaves Mexico. Less than 0.1% of shochu and awamori ever leaves Japan. It's Japan's best kept secret. And so I was really tired of going overseas and again, going to France, going to America, going to Hong Kong, going all over the world and saying, hey guys, I know everybody knows sake. Yes, that's Japan's drink, but actually this is another national drink of Japan that outsells sake in Japan. Everybody drinks it. Everybody knows it. And you guys, I'm here again to bring the news to you again. This is not sticky. I don't know why it's not working. So I got tired. I got frustrated. And right at the beginning of the pandemic, March of 2020, I just quit my job. And then with some other really, really motivated people, started an import company in New York called Honkaku Spirits, Honkaku, Honkaku. And Honkaku in Japanese means authentic. And what we were trying to do was, it's not very complicated. We were just basically taking spirits that we really love, the kind of stuff behind me that I drink at home, and bring them to audiences around the world, starting in the United States. Now, obviously, these are pretty complicated spirits, so they're not really for vodka drinkers necessarily. I think we're looking more at people who really like their whiskey, people who like their mezcal, people who like a drink with a lot of complexity. I think people who are hoppy beer drinkers would get into it. You have to kind of want something more complex in your beer. People who really like to, people who, I don't know what they're called, gourmets, people who really like good food and will, like to cook and those sorts of things. I think we're kind of looking at that section of the world for starters. And it's just, like I've said a couple of times, it's a rabbit hole. This is one of the most fascinating drinks categories on the planet, whether we're talking spirits or otherwise. And there's so much to get excited about in terms of what could be coming to the rest of the world.
Looking at your journey, when you were a kid, you started the alcohol business, the microbrewery at home. Is it crazy to think that it's come a full circle where you kind of started that, you went into education, and now you're full circling back into the alcohol business?
I did not see that coming. That's for sure. I always had the goal, I still have the goal to someday open a brew pub where I get to make the beer and host people and people can have a good time at some place somewhere in the world. And I think that could still happen. But the great thing about Honkaku Spirits is that I've been able to blend my love of craft drinks with my genetic predisposition to education, and bring those together in a way that makes me want to get out of bed in the morning. And so I spend, and get out of bed at night too. I mean, I spend all day, every day, just on Zooms with people, distribution teams, liquor store staffs, just bringing them through the paces of, and this is the great thing about the pandemic, taught us that this is an okay way to communicate, which I'm very grateful for. Because let me tell you, what in March of 2020, I did not envision that we would still be in this state in 2022. So nothing went to plan. It's been a real ride, let me tell you, a real character building experience, I guess we can say. You quit your full-time job and start something new. You start a company, and then all of a sudden, everything goes pear-shaped. And it was, it's been wild. And I know there's a lot of people who started businesses during the pandemic, so this is not a unique story at all. But we've all had to find our own path, and that's been real.
Just listening to you here talk about like craft items and stuff. I'm from Missouri, and so domestic beers, Anheuser-Busch, those traditional items is just like, oh yeah, just give me that. And it's hard for me to get into the craft beer and stuff, but I feel like it's something for people that are listening that's never experienced. It's something you just have to go and try, because it just tests your palate and kind of gives you a different feel of what's being made out there. So for you, someone that's listening that has never experienced a craft item or something different, what would you tell them to go out there and try? How would you get them to have that confidence to be different and try it, expand the horizon in a way?
One thing that's really great about shochu and awamori is that they're made for the culture here in Japan is a drinking and eating at the same time, just as we think of wine culture. But this is a spirit, so it's interesting. They will with food be drinking this at the same time. So the nice thing about shochu is that it's unbelievably flexible with food. There's so many pairing options, and that can be really nice.
Yeah.
It's also, unlike wine, because it's a spirit, there's no real acidity involved. So the spirit won't clash with the food. You won't have any fighting with the food. That's really nice too, because there are very few bad pairings. I've actually never experienced one, I don't think. But the I guess what I would say is, for shochu, yes, there absolutely are lower barriers to entry. And with that in mind, I would say if you go to a restaurant or a bar that has Japanese shochu, don't get it confused with Korean soju. They're completely different drinks. Japanese shochu, I would say you start with either a rice shochu or a barley shochu. Those tend to be really, really recognizable flavors and aromas. Rice shochu is going to remind you a little bit of sake, if you've had that before. You'll get some of the light tropical notes, a little bit of banana, a little bit of melon, maybe some bubble gum and cotton candy. And then it'll be drier though, because there's no residual sugars. They've been cooked out during the distillation process. And those drinks are often going to be great on the rocks. Maybe even with a little bit of seltzer added for something resembling a highball. And they're going to be pretty crushable. Barley shochu, on the other hand, tends to be, especially with what's available in the States right now, tends to be quite light, a little bit fruity, has a nice kind of soft nuttiness or graininess to it, a little bit of a breadiness. Those are also great on the rocks. Sometimes you can dilute them a little bit with a little bit of water as well, just to bring the ABV down lightly. And I think they're really easy drinks for people to understand. Barley, especially because America's a beer and whiskey culture, so it makes a lot of sense to people. So those are very easy on ramps. And then once you get into it more and more, and let me tell you, this is not something you can get your head around in a weekend. There are 5,000 brands of shochu and awamori made in Japan every year. If you ever hear somebody refer to these drinks as Japanese vodka, you have my permission to rake their shins repeatedly. They do not, no respect for that type of, that's rude. So this is a really, really diverse spirits class. I mean, the most popular ingredient used to make shochu in Japan by sales is sweet potatoes. Sweet potato shochu is the big seller. Barley's number 2, rice is number 3. But then, as I said before, there's 53 base ingredients approved by the tax office. And that includes some weirdos like aloe shochu, water chestnuts. What else? Carrots. There's carrot shochu. There's milk shochu. And green tea shochu, and kelp shochu. There's a couple different types of seaweed that can be used. It is wild. And because of single pot distillation, these drinks all taste like what they're made from. So that's something that's really cool. I mean, what does whiskey taste like? Does whiskey taste like, is there an ingredient called whiskey? No, there's not. It's made from grains. It tastes like the barrel though. The flavor in whiskey is from wood. So that's a very, very different type of spirit. These spirits are clear, and they taste like what they're made from. So it's really, really cool. And once you get into it, like, there's no turning back. And once you get more and more into it, then you gravitate towards the more complex styles. And sweet potato is certainly one of the more complex styles. but it's the best seller in Japan because it's so much fun and there's so much to savor. And that's what I'm really excited about for the US market. US consumers are incredibly open to new things, which I really respect, much more so than many other parts of the world that I've traveled to. There's a fascination with new. There's a fascination with authenticity as well, which is also helpful. And there's a curiosity that's just out there, very easy to, it's very easy to scratch that itch, you know. And so it's really enjoyable to go to the States, which I do all the time. I was there for the whole month of April and part of May. I'll be back in September, and I go around to accounts and just teach and pour and get people happy, and hopefully put some nuggets of information in their brains that they will remember the next day and continue to ask questions about the category, and hopefully that leads to something big.
So what does the future look like for you? What are you hoping to accomplish in the next few years, both personally and professionally?
I hope my overriding goal is to help make shochu and awamori a worldwide spirits category, just like gin and bourbon and mezcal and rum. I want everybody at home to know or have heard of shochu, even if they haven't tried it, and know that it's made in Japan primarily. If that happens, I know that I will have been successful in everything that we've talked about today, everything that led me to where I am right now. It was all for a good reason. Now that's going to take time. That's several more decades probably, but I'm prepared to see it through to the end. And personally, on a personal level, I think if I can mix in more family time, both my family in the States and my wife's family in South Korea, if I can make sure that to increase the amount of time spent with them, then that would be a serious success. The last couple of years have been a little rough, as you can probably imagine, for Trans-Pacific and travel, and even going back to Korea has not been hard, even though it's only a 2-hour flight from here. Yeah, so those are a couple of the things that I guess I have my eyes on. I'm very fortunate professionally to be surrounded by some equally passionate people who keep me humble and who I learn from all the time, and who are just great teammates and friends. So it's while things have been incredibly rocky trying to get this business off the ground during the pandemic, when nothing is working correctly and everything takes 5 times as long as it should.
Yeah,
it's going, it's moving. And hopefully if we have a follow-up interview in a few years time, Honkaku Spirits will still be kicking, and we'll have reached new markets and made some new fans.
The final question I'll ask you, for someone that's listening to this interview based on your journey and experience, what tips or advice would you give them to overcome obstacles, accomplish their goals, and rise to the challenge?
I think it's important for people to stop waiting for people to give them permission to do something that they're really passionate about. And that includes stop waiting for yourself to give yourself permission. I mean, oftentimes it's just getting out of our own way. And yes, we're all strapped for time. There are relationships and children and jobs and family responsibilities and community responsibilities and other things, and it's hard. Yep, I totally get it. But you sometimes just need to open the window, throw your cell phone out the window, close the window, so that you can give yourself a little bit more time to just to learn more about that thing that you're curious about, and take it to one step higher. uh I I think that it really just, you just follow what you're interested in, and take it to the nth degree. And many times it's just, if it's possible, then you do it. Right now, obviously you need money to do things, so don't make any
Yeah.
super rash decisions. Sometimes these processes can't just happen overnight, but if you just stick to it, anything is possible. That's for damn sure. um Another thing that I believe, I've demonstrated during this chat today, is that it's really important. I think it's really beneficial to stay curious. Just, if you are interested in something, there's no reason to be happy with the explanation you received. Just go figure it out for yourself.
Yep.
Because there's so much to discover. There's so much fun to be had. And there was a time when I was in college, and I remember walking through the woods, and I I remember looking at all these beautiful old growth trees, and I remember being kind of disappointed that I didn't know what any of them really were. I mean, I knew what a maple tree looked like, but I didn't know what all these other trees were. And I felt like that was a deficit in my understanding of the natural world. So I was just like, well, I should figure this out. And I was inspired by my grandfather too, my mother's father, who was he was a bird watcher, and he knew everything about everything, and he could tell me what all of these, and I was like, I should have some of that. And so I just thought about it, and I read about it, and I walked in the woods more, and I learned about the patterns in the bark, and looked at the leaves and everything. So that's the kind of thing that I think it just adds enjoyment to life.
Yeah.
So stay curious. Just don't allow yourself to, don't accept anything. Just learn more. And yeah, and the third thing is, don't doubt yourself. Don't doubt what you can do. I mean, if you had asked me, hey, if somebody had said, hey, why don't you in the space of 3 years, why don't you move to 2 foreign countries and learn two foreign languages, places in the world that you've never been before and may not need to stay for very long? Cool. And I would have been, as a teenager, I would have been like, why? And and that's a fair response. But at the same time, if the question had been, hey, do you think you can do that? I hope that my answer would have been, yeah, I believe I can handle that. But I don't think that's how I would have answered as a teenager. I would have said, no, I don't. I mean, I'm having a hard time with Spanish. I don't know why I could replicate that process quickly twice over the space of 3 years. But that's the wrong attitude. Just believing that it is possible, understanding that it is going to be hard, but accepting that it's a process, and that if you stick with the process, then anything is possible. So it is a lot about self-belief. It is a lot about not self-reliance too, I suppose. It's just doing it on your own. I which is not to imply that I did everything on my own. I would not be here without my parents. I would not be here without my friends, my wife, my business partners, all the other people that I bounced ideas off of, learned from, reacted to, was inspired by. None of what I'm doing right now would be possible without any of that. So I'm incredibly grateful. But I think also I needed to add a whole lot of my own curiosity, independent self-belief, stubbornness, and learning from my mistakes every damn day, in order to kind of get on the path that I'm on. And I'm nowhere near my goals yet, but I'm on the way, I hope. And with a few lucky bounces, which I feel like I'm due after the last couple of years, things could start to move a little more quickly.
Well, Christopher, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about your rise to the challenge. You're inspiring so many people, and we're excited to see what the future looks like for you.
Thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate it. This has been a blast. And to everybody out there who's listening, a very hearty and heartfelt kanpai from Tokyo, Japan.